My name is Mary Kimani. I'm a conservationist and the chairperson of Lake Naivasha Biodiversity Youth Group, and you're watching Zingi Environmental Series.
Hello everyone, my name is Bernard Muhia. Welcome to the Zingi Environmental Series. Today we are coming from Lake Naivasha. I'm here with Shiv Kapila, the director of the Kenya Bird of Prey Trust. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So we'll be talking to Shiv about his work with the trust. So I'm curious, how did you find yourself working with birds or for birds?
Well, I've always been interested in birds since I was a young boy. And then I had the opportunity to do a master's degree in conservation. I studied fish eagles at Lake Naivasha. And on the first day, we were tagging them and putting radio transmitters on them. And it was just so exciting that from then on, it's just been purely raptors, birds of prey.
Birds. So what excites you about birds?
Well, fundamentally, they can fly. You know? I find that incredibly exciting. And not enough is made about the fact that birds can fly.
Can fly, yeah.
And also, where raptors are concerned, they're exciting to watch. They feed on things that are much, much bigger than themselves in certain cases, and it's just incredibly impressive.
Let's take a step back. What are like the general trends in terms of bird populations since the past, the present, and into the future? What are the predictions?
Well, over the last few decades, they've pretty much all been declining. Especially groups like vultures and owls in sub-Saharan Africa because of certain threats. There's only, I could think of maybe one or two species that are thriving. One of them being fish eagles here. We've got the highest density of fish eagles in Africa on Lake Naivasha. It's purely because they don't compete with humans. They don't prey on livestock. They're also really good for tourism. They boost tourism income. So they're beneficial to people. And I think that's the key. In the short term, if you're beneficial, you do okay. In the long term, where things like vultures are concerned, where they control diseases, a lot of their benefits are not really apparent. So they're underappreciated. And because they're declining at such staggering rates, we're going to feel the consequences. So I'd say that the future is not looking good for birds of prey in general, unless we completely revolutionize our practices and policies by things like energy infrastructure are being concerned, and practices around human-wildlife conflict in particular.
You mentioned benefits. What are the benefits?
Well, vultures are, I'm talking about vultures here now, pretty much, because they offer key ecosystem services. And one of them is controlling diseases by getting rid of carcasses. And they do it incredibly efficiently. So they can digest things like anthrax and botulism, things that are incredibly harmful to people. So they're your free of charge janitor crew that keeps the savannas clean.
Yeah.
And once they're lost, it's particularly prescient talking about this now because we're just at the back end of a 3-year-long pandemic that was caused by improper use of wildlife products and wildlife itself. And so once you lose your vultures, those nasties are going to come back or proliferate. It goes to show that if humans as a species interfere with wild ecosystems, there are consequences to be paid.
Earlier on, you mentioned threats to birds. What are these threats?
There are many and varied, and it stems from the fact that we have 103 species of birds of prey in Kenya, all the way from your tiny pygmy falcon up to lappet-faced vultures, which are one of the largest raptors on the continent. So they're incredibly varied, and their threats are varied. So, for example, medium to large size raptors are declining because of things like poorly constructed power poles, which they use to perch on and get electrocuted. Vultures are declining because of poisoning and things like wind farms. Your smaller birds through persecution and poisoning. So it's all varied, and species has its own particular area of concern. But it's just across the board, all of them are threatened by human activity in some way or another.
So that's the negative side. Are there any positive benefits, or rather anything positive being done that is benefiting the birds?
Well, I think through education and awareness, a lot of people are now being made aware of the problem of poisoning, of electrocutions. So at least we're starting to talk about it. And that's the first step in actually getting to do something about it.
What kinds of ecosystems are birds in general mostly attracted to?
Well, all of them. Every species has evolved to fulfill a certain niche and role in every ecosystem. Like, for example, on lake shores, you have fish eagles catching fish. In savannas, you get large eagles catching antelopes and things like that. You have vultures scavenging. And in deserts, you've got adapted hawks that feed on desert wildlife. So virtually every single environment and habitat has got its communities of birds of prey.
Now specifically here in Naivasha.
Well, Naivasha being one of our very few freshwater lakes is fantastic for things like fish eagles and migrant ospreys. The fringing vegetation is excellent for marsh harriers, which fly over and look for amphibians and insects. The savannas behind the lakes great for things like auger buzzards, your rodent eaters and stuff. Here on this sanctuary, over the last 10 years, I've recorded about 47 different species of birds of prey, so it's incredibly rich. Because we have fringing lakeshore vegetation, acacia forest, and then savanna at the back. So we have a kind of a mosaic of different habitats. We have lake.
Now, still on ecosystems, the United Nations Biodiversity Conference, COP15 in Montreal, was basically talking about biodiversity. What were you happy with? What were you not impressed with about it?
Well, I like that they resolved to protect 30% of, 30% of the world is going to be devoted to biodiversity conservation. What I don't really like is that number is slightly lower than it should be. And also, how are they going to enforce it? How are they going to make sure that is adhered to?
What number are you comfortable, or would you aspire to?
Well, I'm a little biased, so I'll say 95%. But really, ideally, it should be 50-50.
50-50.
Just in Naivasha, I'd like to see the entire riparian zone protected. No encroachment, no building in it. I'd like to see tree planting projects like yours, for example. I would like to see all sorts of different community projects that focus on wildlife and biodiversity conservation.
Now, what's the relationship between development and biodiversity with a special focus on now energy production?
Well, our growing population needs energy. I'm glad we're trending towards renewable sources like geothermal wind farms, but the problem is it needs to be sited correctly. In other countries around the world, especially in the West, national parks are sacrosanct. They're hallowed ground. It's illegal to actually put any human infrastructure in them apart from the ones that cater to tourism.
So once the power is produced, albeit green energy, it needs to be transported.
It needs to be transported, yes.
And what's the intersection between that and birds?
Well, the way that the power is transported to, local power transport through power lines and poles. In the West, most of these residential lines are put underground. That solves many problems. There cease to be unsightly edifices in the landscape, Because they're underground and protected, they don't need maintenance, and they don't. Short circuits are not caused by wildlife getting electrocuted on. Here in Kenya, we've gone from the relatively safe wooden power lines to the absolutely lethal concrete ones. The concrete design also, it's very hazardous with the cross arm and the insulators at head height when you're, say, a bird that's about a foot tall. Also, the concrete itself has to have metal rebar going through it, and that adds another hazard. This rebar often emerges and is exposed at the top, allowing a bird to perch on it, but then form a connection to earth, and then when it sees something it wants to eat and spreads its wings out, it gets electrocuted. So these concrete power lines, I think, started emerging about 6 or 7 years ago, and have in our vision 2030 to electrify the whole of the country and provide power to every corner of it. They're being rolled out at increasing speed, and they kill a lot of birds of prey simply by how they're made and, well, their design.
How should they be made to make them safe?
Well, they can be retrofitted by putting molded rubber caps onto them so they become bird friendly. The insulators and lines themselves can hang below the cross arm, which actually makes more sense, because imagine you're carrying a 5-liter jerry can. You want to carry it hanging below. It's much easier rather than carrying it up like that. So those will not only make them bird friendly, but they'll cut costs. So for example, every single time there's an unplanned power cut, either a branch has fallen on the lines or a bird has perched on the cross arm and got electrocuted, causing a short circuit. With this kind of design where the lines are hanging low and you've got rubber caps on it, these problems will not occur.
Now, when a bird gets electrocuted, how much power or electricity goes through them?
Well, these are high voltage, high amperage lines, so it's always a fatal shock. Problem is that bird anatomy allows them to survive the majority of the time, because if you imagine that a bird's body is a 30 amp fuse, but its limbs are 5 amp fuses, and it gets shocked, the 5 amp fuses will blow, usually from 1 foot to the opposing wing. The body can survive that shock, but because the limbs and the blood in the limbs has been superheated to 6,000 degrees centigrade or whatever over the course of, a fraction of a second or a second, those limbs atrophy and die over the next few weeks. The bird can still keep flying around and using its feet for a limited amount of time, because the muscles that control the ligaments going to the distal parts of its limbs are controlled higher up on the thigh, and that hasn't been completely burnt. So you have these very disturbing and harrowing scenes where you have a bird that's been brought in by someone for rehab. The foot is completely dead, but it can still flex its toes. Eventually, after a while, that foot will completely dry up, the wing will completely dry up and eventually fall off. So since these power poles have been changed out to the concrete ones, we get an average of, say, 20 to 30 birds brought in a year with electrocution injuries. And that's actually a very, very low estimate of the problem, because a bird that knows it's going to die will hide and die in silence underneath a bush or something. And then it also takes a special kind of person to recognize that a bird is injured, pick it up, and then bring it to us. So maybe the problem is 3,000 birds dying a year, 5,000 birds dying a year. So we don't have a handle on this problem. We have in the past had students do projects looking underneath the lines for dead birds, but in a country like Kenya, that's not going to work, because we have a huge amount of scavengers here. Small carnivores and large carnivores like hyenas and what have you, that go under the lines and pick up what's dead, take it away and eat it. So you can't quantify 3,000 birds dying a year, 5,000.
You mentioned that people bring in birds. What should someone do when they find an electrocuted or an injured bird?
Well, first be careful of their feet if they're still working. Try to scoop it up on the back by holding its wings together. Immediately put it into a large cardboard box, not large enough that I can flap around and potentially cause more damage to itself. But the importance is to keep it in a cool, dark place and then bring it in as soon as possible. In fact, we've had over the last year or so 2 martial eagles brought in, which is an endangered species. It's the largest eagle in Africa, both from electrocutions, and both ended up dying. One came from a protected area just north of Naivasha, and the other one came from Sava West National Park. In fact, it was a Taita Hill Sanctuary. So these are protected areas with this harmful infrastructure going through it. So this is happening all over the country, and in theory, this should be illegal.
There is limited involvement of local communities in decision-making processes. For example, like whether power lines should be put in protected areas. What do you think? How do you think this can be rectified?
Well, I mean, there needs to obviously be a period of due diligence where the authorities putting in the power do speak to local communities and conservationists and scientists about the potential problems of those projects, and also should be open to ideas of how to make these lines safe. I mean, a small example is right here on this sanctuary. A few years ago, KPLC came in and cut down the relatively safe but power poles, wooden ones, to put these concrete ones in. And those wooden poles did not need to be changed out. They were in perfect working order. There was no decay or rot to the posts, and they did not inform me about it. I would have said, no, you can't do this. This is private property, and I'd rather have the wooden poles rather than the concrete ones. But they did this in the course of a day, and no notification, no asking permission, so I was not involved in that decision. So that's the kind of thing they need to change.
Okay. The next 5 years, what does it look like with regards to working with birds?
Unfortunately, more of the same. We've got a growing human population that needs to be fed, clothed, and supplied with power. Our protected areas and wild areas are getting smaller and smaller and more degraded. So it is an uphill battle, unfortunately.
So before we wind up, I'd like us to play a game. I'll ask you a few trick questions.
Okay.
So a plane flying from Nairobi to Kisumu, and it crashes somewhere in between Nairobi and Kisumu.
Yeah.
Where will they bury the survivors?
They won't bury the survivors.
True.
Because they're still alive.
True.
Yeah.
That's the correct. So we've been speaking to Shiv Kapila, the director at the Kenya Bird of Prey Trust. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Welcome.
And we look forward to a safe future for birds.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Bernard Mohe.